Welcome to the Word and Journey podcast, stories that shape us and make us think, and that bring us together to talk about them. I had something more profound to say about that, but that's all that came out. I'm a little out of practice. It's been a little bit since we've done this show, but I'm glad to finally be back in the books and with new friends for you all. So y'all faithful listeners, you few out there, I'd like you to meet Mike Savara, who is my partner in crime for this one. Hey, Mike, how are you?
Hey, good. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, glad you could be here. Would you say a little bit about who you are and what's your corner of the world and something interesting about you?
Ooh, yeah, I don't know about interesting, but yeah, my name's Mike Savara. I live in Hillsboro, Oregon, and I work in government and supporting homeless services here in Oregon. I'm a social worker by training and an addictions counselor, so I've been working in the housing, homelessness, behavioral health field for the better part of a decade now, and yeah, you and I have been friends for a good while as well, so we go way back. And I think, yeah, excited to talk about this book a little bit and think about just kind of the I don't know, some of the lessons and some of the ideas that it's trying to draw out. So excited to dig in more.
Cool, thank you, and always great to hear more from you. Uh, so you're in government and social worker, addictions counselor, and I'm also an addictions counselor by trade too, at least in my day job. And I can imagine the listener being like, okay, so why are we listening to these guys talk about books? I mean, they're not even like literary experts. True. Although there may be some modeling going on because like everyone should read books. And I think everyone should read books actively. And there's a way where, well, there's definitely a way we read books through the different lenses that we have. So sure, our lens is more clinical than academic for sure, but I think there's a lot of value to that. Well, obviously because I'm putting my voice out in the air, but
Yeah, I
so
feel like that's a good point. Like, I'm definitely not a literary expert, and I think you're right. Like, um, I think there's something special about being able to dig in as non-experts and as folks that maybe had you know to talk about like what books make us feel, and to think about how books and stories help us think about ourselves in different ways. Like, I think it's really helpful in that way, and like that's actually really human, a really human experience to like think about how stories impact us.
yeah, yeah, very much so. Because I mean, certainly it's not just academic people that are reading stories and being affected by them. So if you had to go to school to know how a story is impacting you, well, you might get impacted quite a bit more than you think. So anyway, uh, that said, that's our excuse for being here and why we think you should listen to us. So, um, all right. So this one, so we're tackling Lightbringer, which is book 6 of the Red Rising saga. Which I got to say, Mike. So this was one that you recommended way back when. So I owe this all to you. You'd introduced me to this one, and from the first line, I was just in love with this whole story and this whole world. So thank you for that. Um, we should also say we're in serious spoiler territory from here, as this is book 6 of a saga, and we'll be talking about it and not holding anything back. So, um, but for the new person or for the person who's been a little bit familiar with the story but hasn't been here in a while, maybe a brief narration might be in order, just so we get a little bit caught up on things. Do you want to try summarizing at least roughly like kind of the story so far?
Uh,
Like,
Red Rising in general.
yeah, like from the mines of Lycos to where we're at now.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like the books have been for me just like really really powerful in that like the themes of like redemption and the themes of like thinking about of like world change, just like kind of go through the whole journey. But I mean, I think that the key is like we follow character Darrow, who we find in a society that is extremely stratified through different castes that essentially have been created and modified through genetic changes over millennia. And we find the whole striation of like colors and castes, going from like the folks at the very bottom that are literally working in the mines to create fuel and make sure that there's that the society works, the red caste, all the way to the top golds, who are essentially superhuman, extremely strong, intelligent, have all of the genetic predispositions and supports to be able to rule the society, and they do. And I think it like really the story, it's hard to summarize all of it, but really like going from Darrow's loss of his wife when he's in the mines because the gold captors essentially murder his wife Io, to transformation in himself. He actually sort of becomes a gold. He's genetically transformed by a carver to be able to become equal with the folks that are ruling the society, and he goes on to essentially conquer the society and to transform the way it is that folks are stacked against each other. There's also a sort of a 10-year gap in time that where we jump from the first trilogy to the second trilogy, or second set of books. That's where book 6 starts. So I think that gap in time is really critical. We're jumping into essentially that first rising event, all the way into the future, where we see Darrow and his friends essentially ruling the society and at war with the Gold Society. And so they've set up a whole new form of government that the society hasn't utilized before, essentially a form of democracy. And they're in a battle for it all. So I think that's like a really quick summary in one way of saying, like, the book really drives from that point, and kind of we jump right into a battlefield essentially, where they're facing a lot of challenges to try to be able to make it work. So I think I don't know, what else would you add besides some of those
Mm,
things? It's definitely a hard call to be able to summarize
right.
the whole thing, but anything else you think that's important to mention?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I appreciate that. There, you capture a lot of like the heart of it, where we really are following, Darrow of Lycos, who, yeah, we meet him where he's at the bottom of the caste system, and we watch him in all of his adventures, allies and enemies, as he steadily climbs to the top. And once he's at the top, what does he do with that? Um, I, I love this kind of story arc where you take kind of like a nobody character. Actually, I think there's aspects of oh, what's the Pat Rothfuss one? Name of the Wind. There's something a little bit similar there, where you take somebody who's kind of this nobody, has nothing, and you introduce them to they get an opportunity to step into this newer, bigger world, and they steadily build a name for themselves. First, actually, Ender's Game kind of follows this trajectory too. Like, so with Darrow, you see him; he's first surviving the mines, and then within Gold Society, he goes to their institute to learn how to be a soldier, and then he wins there, and then from there he gets put into like real battles and bigger real battles and bigger real battles and everything. So there very much is this exploding arc of majesty. A world building detail we could add is the way this world is set up. It's set across the solar system. So there's actually not very much of it that takes place on Earth itself. Like the human race has kind of moved out into all of the other planets, and so the first trilogy we're talking about takes place within what are the core planets. So like Mercury, Earth, Venus, Mars, and that's really focusing on dismantling the sovereign, who is the ruler of everything, and placing a new person there. And it's the woman who ends up becoming Darrow's wife. She becomes a sovereign, and then 10 years later, Darrow has a kid. His best friends have a kid, and now he's not only grappling with how do I hold the society together, but also how do I hold my family together. Uh, I was thinking, I was appreciating how the I was appreciating that time gap because it's fun. We meet him when he's 16. He's a teenage hero. That's really fun. Now where we're at in like book 6, he's like early 30s. So like closer to my age now. And so like relatable in a really different way. And now there's like these family struggles overlaid over the political struggles. So I really appreciate that dynamic. Um, yeah. So uh, a theme question that comes up a little bit, uh, actually quite a bit through this. So the way that gold society set up, again, golds, they're the top caste. They're these super beautiful, super strong, super smart, super privileged, also super debauched people generally, and they there's a tyranny to how they run their society. Is very much based on the Roman Empire. Even in like a lot of the language they use, a lot of the names they use, there's aspects of Roman culture, like the Roman Empire. And so here comes Darrow, and he's bringing this idea of like, hey, democracy and freedom, and people can having the right to self govern and things. And certainly for our sensibilities as Americans, we tend to like that idea. But it is really interesting, especially once we introduce the Lysander character, uh, to kind of get both sides of that. Lysander, he was um, was he a nephew or grandson of the
Nephew.
previous sovereign? Yeah. And in the first trilogy, he's like 10, but now in the second trilogy, he's an adult, and he's one of the main characters. And we get into, there's some of the chapters that are from his point of view, and so and he's a very likable character too. So we get this really likable expression of democracy and this really likable expression of favoring tyranny or like a really strict monarchy or something, and everything. So I'd be curious. What are your thoughts on how they frame that political question of like what sort of government actually is good or bad for people?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know, like the I don't know. It's interesting you're saying like Lysander as like a likable character because there's parts of him like anyone that's just I think like just so incredibly flawed, and like in his case, his his ability to focus only on like his ambitions and like the glory that he's seeking, um, and sort of you know cross and stab in the back so many people that have cared for him for so long. Like it's like there's these aspects of him that are a lot like Darrow. So I think there's similarities like this figure Darrow being so focused on his mission and accomplishing that mission. In one of the big themes in Lightbringer is Darrow's reckoning with his sins, reckoning with his mistakes in his past, and you see. I feel like you don't see Lysander like reckoning with them in the same way that Darrow does. And so for me, it's like part of it is like they both have had to do some incredibly evil things in order to survive, in order to accomplish their objectives. But there's the reckoning and the guilt and the atonement for those things looks very different in a way. I feel like the whole like the concept that it's trying to talk about around what form of government is maybe ideal or whatever is interesting too, because in one of the major scenes in the book, the republic collapses. Essentially, it becomes totally they're voting on whether or not to send an additional fleet of war of ships into a battle on Mercury, and there's there's a murder in the middle of essentially the Senate floor during that time, and then a riot follows. And it's like, I think that there's this theme of like the attempt to have a different form of government, have a different way of interacting, resulting in sort of the same endless cycle of like power grab and who's in charge, and then sort of a revolt from the people. And in this case, it's the very people that the republic was set up to support and save, actually going and rioting in the Senate, and it's like there's this tension, I think, that they're getting at, that like there is not necessarily a perfect form of like how to structure society, and you see that time and time again in the story, like wrestling with like how much do they embrace sort of sovereign role versus the embracing a more democracy oriented one. So yeah, I think there's a big tension there, that they're trying to point out that like it wasn't perfect before under the gold overlords, and it also isn't perfect in the new republic either.
Right. So here's where I'm going to bring in some of my counselor nerddom a little bit. Uh, so when talking about what is mental health and what is a healthy mind, some people, there's a nonfiction writer named Dan Siegel who will talk about this, but talk about like a healthy integration as a balance between states of rigidity and chaos. And in a way, we could look at the goals as representing more of that rigidity, tyranny, really firm order, and it is well ordered. Like when the caste system is in place, like everybody knows their place, everybody does their job, the society functions. Now it's completely lacking in compassion and any sense of like good Christian virtue or anything, but it does function and it does thrive in a fashion. And then on the other hand, a little bit beyond democracy, like we get into like the Sons of Ares. They're kind of a terrorist group, or some of the other splinter cells of revolutionaries wanting to overthrow the tyranny. That's too much tyranny. They descend into riots, and there's a lot of murders, and there's a lot of just like unregulated. We're angry. We're taking on justice according to our own vision, and it's chaos. And on an individual level, we could say either of those states represents unhealth or pathology, and ideally, like in the middle, we find some sense of more of that fluidity. And we could say even this is part of like the Christian vision of justice. Also, it's bringing a right order to things that's not too strict, but it's not too gentle. It's able to speak the truth, but also in love. And yeah, and it kind of feels like, well, the society in general kind of misses that for most of the story. And yeah, some Darrow is an individual who's trying to find that for himself. Virginia Mustang, his wife, she's another who's like kind of like aiming for that middle if she can. But yeah, they kind of stand out because of that, because they kind of have the capacity to not be so extreme. Although when you're in war, everything's extreme.
Yeah, it's true. Like and I think Darrow especially is, he's essentially their greatest general, right? And so at this point in the timeline, he is, in Mercury, leading the as the general, leading the charge. And I think the one of the political tension points that I found really interesting was that like he had lost support of like all of the bands of different essentially political parties that exist within the republic structure. So like he his ability to be so focused, on war and on the ability on his role in leading the revolution in a sense, and then continuing to fight against gold, alienates tons of folks. But also there's other folks that want him to be more destructive and more dangerous, and there's other folks that want to see him essentially turn his sword into a plowshare, like being more focused on like rebuilding society. And so he very clearly sees his role as like different and distinct than Virginia's role, which is she's the sovereign leading sort of the political. And there's even like, a lot of insight, I think, in this book about her ability to navigate the politics of all of the things, and actually try to get all of the different parties aligned. Um, so yeah, you're right. It's like there's this sense that he's extremely focused on his mission, his role, and as Lightbringer rolls on, you see him start to question that a little bit and start to understand, like, he goes through essentially a spiritual awakening throughout the book. He essentially loses, and then is faced with like kind of dealing with himself for like the first time, and actually like trying to figure out like who he wants to be and how he wants to show up. And it's like it really changes his, um like, I think I'm also about like you're thinking about mental health, like his anxiety is so heightened and so strong in like the first sections of the book. And then as he goes through the spiritual awakening, he starts to think about the different philosophies that this book, essentially he meditates on every single day. It starts to really help him understand and think differently about how he wants to be and who he wants to be for his family and for the folks that rely on him.
Hmm. I'm really loving that aspect of the story, and I'm only like a little bit into the story, so I haven't seen like all of the fullness of it. But yeah, it's like he's like goes to this little self-made rehab in a sense. Like he hits his rock bottom, he almost dies, uh, only barely survives because Cassius rescues him, and then yeah, he's like alone on a moon, not even a moon, on like a trash asteroid for like 8 months, like in silence, training with his razor sword and reading this book, which I don't think there's been mentions of this book before Lightbringer, but it's this spiritual sort of text. It has this very like Buddhist, Taoist. I know those are different. It has this very like Eastern philosophy flair to it, and yeah, it's bringing out this whole different side of him that he hasn't really had a chance to cultivate so much. Uh, but definitely from a writing standpoint, I mean, so I'll comment on the writing style a little bit because so it's in a first person narrative, which I really love those, and the Pierce Brown, the author, he takes you through these really extravagantly glorious like action scenes and battle scenes, and the visuals depicted are just so pristine and really exciting. But then he intersperses that with a lot of really deep reflections, and like once you're in with Darrow said, especially like he gets in and you really get into his inner life and all of the things he's wondering is like, and one of the things he does is he questions his role, he questions war, he questions like, am I doing any good? Like is this all that I am? And like what do I really need to do? And so from a writer standpoint, I really appreciate the range of expression that this character has, and yeah, it's good.
Yeah, one piece on the different perspectives. I was just reading a few of like Pierce Brown's comments on that, and I guess he played with the idea of having different perspectives incorporated. So he has Lyria and Virginia and Darrow all represented, but I think he even played with Severo as a one of the narrators in a sense, and which I would have loved
I
personally.
would
I
have
think
loved that so much.
Severo's character is really complex and dark and moody in a lot of ways, and so like throughout throughout the book, you try to put yourself in Severo's shoes. He's essentially encompassed by grief for much of the book, and it would have been really interesting, I think, to just hear more about Severo's perspective, and maybe there's a future role where he can play with and bring out Severo's perspectives and things a little bit more. But it is really powerful, I think, to be able to get all the different perspectives from different folks. And then just one thing, I read it through an audiobook on Audible, and I think it was helpful in the prior book, in Dark Age. You see multiple different narrators playing the different characters. So essentially everyone's voice was a different narrator, which I found helpful in one way. And in this one, it's just Tim Gerard Reynolds, who's an amazing voice actor and was able to capture all the different nuance of the different characters just on his own. But it was also interesting, just like the choice of not going with a whole cast, but going with just one person. I'm not sure what drove that necessarily, but I found it helpful a little bit to have that continuation of just like the one voice for the entire audiobook too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he really is really good at this. So, yeah, there's a part of me that kind of wants to like read it and actually turn pages, but then I think I would definitely miss it, miss the voice that goes with it. But yeah, speaking of Severo, speaking of Virginia, Cassius, and all of them, I wonder maybe we could talk a little bit about the relationships that go on, because it's very much not just a war story. There's a lot of drama attached to, and they say drama more in like the literary sense of like there's a lot of character building, a lot of character interactions that go throughout it, and um, one of the dynamics we can notice, and this is really accentuated, like at the end of the last book when Darrow's escaping Mercury, and like here the in Lightbringer, there's this one moment where where Darrow thinks he's going to rescue Severo, and then it turns out Severo saves him in his own rescue attempt or something. I get so we could say Darrow, he's this great hero, he's the war god, but he's also like pretty like contingent on his friends, and there's a lot of scrapes he gets through only because people came to help him and things. And I wonder what's your take on that, or how do you experience that? What do you take away from that?
Yeah, I love that point. And that's I think that's one of the learnings that Darrow has throughout the book too, is that he's the Reaper of Mars, he's the one figure in a sense, but when you actually sit down and think like, well, where would he be without it? He's there's this one scene where he's talking with Severo, um, who Severo and Darrow's relationship after they reconnect is sort of in the trash heap. Like it's like definitely they're very much I think trying to understand how they move forward based on all of the trauma and all the terribleness that's happened. And so like there's this one quote where he says, so what you're saying is without your friends you'd be slagged and the rising would be ashes. And then he goes on to say like, where do you think I'd be? So where would Darrow be without Severo, without you, without our friends? Dead in a ravine, that's where. We hold each other up. We always have. That's not weakness. That's the only strength we've got. More than anyone, you've been there for me, and you've been my engine for half a life. My turn. And so Darrow is essentially saying, like, you are the reason I am alive. You're the reason I've been able to do anything, And Darrow he's trying he's trying to ask Severo to give him a little bit of that weight that he's holding, because Severo is dealing with some really horrendous grief from the murder of his child, and like that that weight Severo was holding alone, and Darrow's like, hey, that's not how this works. You can rely on me for once, So I really appreciate you naming that. It's like he's the whole book really is about like how how do they move forward in this like horrible place together, and like that there's not any one person, and I think that's again a big difference between Lysander and Darrow. Is Lysander's willing to throw relationships out. He even is himself betrayed later on in the book. So you see like I think a level of like, I'm going to go it alone. I'm going to be the sovereign, the one on the morning chair from Lysander. And Darrow, I think, is slowly realizing that anytime he's tried to go it alone, and not counted on his friends, he fails. He's failed time and time again, and he's been saved time and time again by his friends. So
Hmm.
his approach of like, I need my friends.
Hmm.
Even in the moments, I think we'll probably get to this later, but even in the moments where he's alone, in a sense, like in a battle on his own, he's still relying on Cassius to help guide him in terms of his tactics and strategy. Like, he's not ever really alone. He's always got his friends that are holding him up, and I think that it says something about even like the title of the book, Lightbringer. Like, that's the I think Brown is probably trying to do a little bit of that's the title that Selenius Al Ra, the sort of
Lysander's ancestor.
Lysander's ancestor. That's like this, or Selenius Al Lune, excuse me. That is the Lysander's kind of prototype, or just like the archetype of like what it means to be the sovereign. And everybody sort of always goes back to, well, Selenius did this, and that Lightbringer concept, I think, is essentially the Loon family concept. And it's interesting. I think they're playing with it a little bit to say, what does it look like to come out of darkness and into light? And like Darrow's vision of that is very different than Lysander's vision of that.
Mm.
And so I think there's a lot that they're trying to do contrasting between the two characters in a
Mm.
sense.
I was thinking about that contrast in relation to friends and things, because so Lysander's not alone; he's got people around
Yeah.
him, but you do get a sense he's not motivated by the people around him in the same way that Darrow is. Like you're saying, like Lysander, he's after power, he's after the chair. He's kind of also after like his vision of justice for the society, but in kind of a big sense, not in a personal sense. Whereas Darrow, he's like he's got his wife Virginia, his son Pax, you know, Severu and Vitra and their kids. And even going back to like the first line of Red Rising, he's like, what was it? Like, I wanted peace, but my enemies wanted war, or like I
Mm-hmm.
would have lived in peace, but my enemies wanted war. Great hook, by the way. Well done, Mr. Brown. But like even from the start, like Darrow originally, he doesn't want to be a warrior. He just wants to like mind his own business and work with his hands. Granted, I mean, he works in a terrible situation, but like, you know, he's all about his family and his community, and that really continues all throughout his campaign. Even as he becomes a general, like he's very invested in like, how do I take care of the people around me? Sure, how do we win? But how do I take care of the people around me? And that really shapes his character in a whole lot of different ways, and shapes his responses to trauma in a whole lot of different ways. So,
Yeah. Yeah, it's so true. And I think it also gets at like this, so like there's this other, like one of the big I guess political dynamics in Lightbringer is the core versus the outer ring, right? So like the asteroid belt has almost a they're almost like a separate society in a sense. They have many of the same strategies and policies and stuff, but their lineage is very different, and sort of, and the way of living is even very different. And I think you see, Lysander's vision is a unified gold overseeing all of the other colors, right? And that unified vision requires the rim to be able to collaborate and work with the core, but the core has, murdered their people, done horrendous things for centuries, and so there's very little trust and very little coordination, collaboration between sort of the core golds and the golds in the rim. And so I think like you see, the different approaches, even in terms of like what their visions are, kind of playing out in some sense. And you see Darrow, who's made alliances with the Rim in the past, and even in this book, trying to tap into those alliances to try to think like, how do we move this forward? How do we accomplish our shared objectives? But there's this sense of like that um, their ways of going through conflict, and thinking about how much they rely on the people around them and building trust is like very different, in a lot of different aspects of like just how they're trying to actually move through the work that they're committed to.
mm-hmm. Yeah, There seems like there's an aspect of this story that is, what's the term? Um, non-dualistic, whatever the counterpart of that is. Um, in that there's a more distinct sense of what is the good and what is the evil. Different than like an equally expansive universe like the Game of Thrones story. There's not any clear good or evil. It's mostly just various shades of evil. And so in that sense, like you don't really see people growing or changing. You see people becoming like more extreme versions of their most wounded parts. Um, in this story, there's a lot of that going on still, where people are wounded, people are broken, and they're acting in the extremities of that. Um, but I don't know. Tell me what you think, because I get the sense that there is a capacity for change. Watching Darrow, watching Cassius in particular, I've really come to appreciate like his character arc and all that goes on there. Um, but they definitely hit these depraved rock bottoms where they do these horrible things, but then the world is built where they have this internal capacity to like reflect a bunch and atone and amend and things, make sacrifices and become better, or become something. They seem like they have the capacity to change within the worldview of this story.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's a huge part of like I think definitely Cassius's arc is like uh he he's never really part of the of either group in a sense. He's essentially been out on his own for the better part of a decade with Lysander actually together, but then he is essentially secretly been working with Virginia, and swoops in at the last minute to save Darrow and a few of his friends, and it's like they're the reality is like he's also the person that murdered Severa's father, and who is like the sort of like lead figure, the mastermind behind Red Rising, behind the Rising itself. So like he's got this guilt, I think, that he lives with for having done that and having played that part. And you see him, he's clearly addicted to alcohol, really struggling with, I'd say like just his ability to reconcile like the different aspects of him, and then you see like Darrow, I think in a similar way. He Earlier in the series, he betrays the Rim sons of Ares, or the daughters of Ares, and he essentially gives up names to the enemy and says like, here's like all of our spies, and thousands of people are murdered because he chose to do that. And so he's got to live with the weight when he goes out to the Rim, and like they don't trust him and they actually want to murder him, and they trick him and make this whole they all think they're gonna get the axe basically, and it really is only because of Severo that they're able to survive. But like I think there's this aspect of dealing with your like both dealing with like the like personal like reality of like I've done wrong or I've harmed someone, like essentially the concept of like the theme of redemption, in the book, and like how various characters are throughout their atoning for some of their mistakes or some of the things that they've done in the past, and like that just what a huge aspect of the book that actually looks like.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes, that happens a lot. Um, yeah, I feel like one of the characters in the yeah, definitely the Cassius character. He goes through a lot of that because he is Darrow's friend. He's Darrow's enemy. He's kind of on the outs. He's in exile. He's Darrow's friend again. As he's just like trying and trying and trying. Another character in the second trilogy is Ephraim. I think he's a gray. So the gray, if I understand right, is they're like a soldier caste, kind of like infantry caste, different than like the Golds, who are like the super soldiers, and the Obsidians, who are like the super savage warriors. Anyway, but he's someone too where like I mean, we meet him. He's a professional thief, and um, just he kind of comes off as like I'm just out for myself, and then I mean he gets caught up in obviously caught up in some drama and kidnaps Darrow's kid and everything and then or whatever. But like he also like again he gets caught up in or he gets caught in the relationships and not even like romantic relationships, but like he just there's this one woman on his team, and then he connects with Lyria, who is one of the other point of view characters, and he kind of gets a sense of like I kind of want to be more than a scumbag, and so goes on this whole journey of like how do I start to fight back a little bit, or how um, I don't know if he specifically words it this way, but he becomes that character who's essentially asking, "Is this all that I am? Can I be more than myself?" And making he makes some efforts to do that. So he's someone else I think that really explores that in a really powerful way, with kind of a brutal end, but with it in a powerful way.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. He's a good example of that, I think. And like, I think for me, I think a lot of times about just like what is like how do humans change? Like, what does that actually look like? Because I think for anyone that's ever tried to change a thing in their life, it's like incredibly difficult, and especially changing something that's like very embedded in like maybe who they are or like their profession, what they do, or like the way they see themselves, your identity. Like I know for myself it's difficult to there's times where I've like wanted to change a behavior that I have because it's maybe hurting people around me, or it's like not fulfilling like an aspect of who I want to be anymore. And like that I think one thing that you see in this book is that it's not a linear process of change, and it's not a change process that's always even um like easy, easy to draw out. So like there you see the process that Ephraim goes through. He's still like he steals back the children at one point. So he's using like some of the same behaviors and skills that sort of like he wants to think about changing in order to like help, in order to be this other person. And I think I know it shows you something a little bit about like what human how to change as a human. I think that like it isn't always it's easy to get so down and be like I've failed, or I've not changed actually. But I think it's looking at the trajectory of someone's life and sort of the overall arc that's really important here. And I think you see that again and again, even for like several of the characters meet like a really poor ending, and you see that like that they often there's often this redemptive aspect of like how they go out, that I think obviously life doesn't always look like that, but I think there is this aspect of like um just because you're changing, just because things are different and you're trying, doesn't mean that it always like everything's like a nice neat bow and that things are like perfect. I think there's like there's it's almost like fighting against that tendency in us that like if I put in X, I will get out Y, because that belief sometimes is at the root of a lot of, I think, in terms of like mental health, a lot of unhappiness, right? This idea that if I do the thing, then I should get this, but life just doesn't always work like that. People don't behave the way we think they will, and it's just really tricky to actually get change done. And holding those things with an open hand is really important. Recognizing like you might put in your change work, but it might not look the way you thought it would.
Right. Yeah, and then yeah, it's change isn't linear, and it's not something you can control or predict usually. Uh, yeah. Another interesting thing that goes on. So you briefly mentioned the carvers earlier. So the carvers, they're in the Red Rising world. They're kind of like a surgeon, or they're the people who are able to essentially like carve up a person and transform them. So Darrow in book one, he works with Mickey the Carver, who literally like tears him open, installs bones, installs hormones, and puts in new hair, changes his eyes out, you know, and like makes him into a gold body. And and I wonder if there can be this tendency to think like, if I can just change who I am, thinking about just like the fleshly part, then that'll be good. That'll be everything. And for a while, in Darrow's case, it seems like that's kind of the trajectory. They're like, hey, I have this gold body. Now I'm the perfect weapon. At one point, one of his leaders actually wants him to go like, get into this huge gathering of golds and like blow himself up and blow all of them up, because they're like, hey, we've made you into an object. We've in making you this perfect human, we've also taken away your humanity, and we want to use you in a particular way. But with the change that you're exploring, I think it goes way beyond that to like, okay, now I've got this perfect body. But what kind of person am I? Am I a good person? And do I build people up? Do I tear people down? Uh, you know, changes more than just the body, although the body matters too. So there's that tension. There's a little lot of tension there.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think Darrow's like story is probably like it's like the most like visceral, of the change arcs, because it's like, he goes from probably being like under 5 feet tall or something like that to probably standing, I don't know, over 6'5" for sure, and just like that physical change and his strength and his speed, but it's um I think it's also interesting, like his the Rising has this concept of like Eo's dream. Like Eo, his first wife, had this dream of a world where she was treated equally, and she had more, essentially, and that like people like her had more, and that's like one of the things that catches fire in a sense in this society and transforms so much. And I think it's interesting that like he clings on to that, and it wasn't even like his dream in a sense. It was his wife's dream, and that's like in a sense a north star that he goes back to time and time again about like, well, how do I realize that dream? And I think it helps him make decisions in a lot of ways about like how he wants to be. And then I think in Lightbringer you start to see him digging into the book that really digs into like how the different practices in a sense that are identified. So like he starts to bring that into the frame in terms of like, here's how I can be in this situation, and he applies those. And even like I think about that there's the one sort of final epic one-on-one fight scene, the ashram. He's consciously slowing down and thinking and being like meditative during the battle, and he realizes that he doesn't need to it's like he doesn't need to strive anymore. He can sort of let it flow in a sense. And he's you see like that realization that like that's actually how he's been living his life generally, and then it becomes part of the way he fights as well. And
Hmm.
I don't know, I just think about that, like oftentimes, when I think about like, I want to change, or I want something to be different in my life, it's not I think about that scenario, but really I also want to be thinking about the things I'm feeding myself and the way I am in, and not just in that scenario. Like an example is like, will I give in to fear in a situation that might be really scary or really overwhelming? Will I give into that fear, or will I um, uh, by practice of relying on other people and being in touch with myself, be able to say, you know what, time and time again, I've not had to be given to fear, and I can find courage in this moment. And I think there's like, it's really important that like the those big moments in our life aren't the only thing that kind of drive us to think about who we are. You know, it's like all the little things, the day to day, moment to moment decisions we make that really like shows us who we really are, I think. And you see that a lot in this book too.
Yeah, yeah, you do. There's bringing in some other, counseling jargon too. We will talk about, being wary of your lows and recognizing wherever your lowest point is, you usually don't stay there. And also, whenever you're at your highs, you also don't really stay there either. So getting a sense for, I have this natural up and down. Um, I had it was actually a client recently that kind of came up with this idea of like being like successful on average, or being like mindful, more sober, like on average, and hopefully that average is like steadily working its way upward. And I love that idea of um, kind of weighing out the average over time, recognizing, yeah, I'm gonna do some great things, I'm gonna do some terrible things, I'm gonna stray from my path to the right or to the left. But the key often becomes, do I at least know my way back to the path? Do I have that North Star of like, here's the vision that I'm pursuing, a way that I want to be changing, and failing well in that sense. Like, I failed, but I know how to get back to where I need to be.
I like that. I feel like you get a lot of wisdom from um, people that are walking like a a difficult path. Like I'm sure whatever your client is going through. Like I'm sure that wisdom is hard won. And it's super. I think it's super apparent of like just how yeah how difficult it is to think about how to move through hard things. And if you don't have like a guidepost or somewhere where you're somewhere that's like that you can look to when you're going through a hard thing, it just really is like you can get knocked off course so easily.
Yeah, yeah. Which and a lot of people in faith traditions and a lot of sobriety traditions, I mean, they hold this idea of like the higher power as very much that, and offering that. But even aside from that, finding things a lot in relationships. And again, in the story we're reading, Darrow, he really finds himself in the people around him, and he he's part of this network web of relationships that really define him. Like, much as, and again, in contrast to Lysander, who's much more just like on his own a lot of the time, kind of seeking to make a name for himself. Like, Darrow kind of has his self given to him by the people around him, and it's when he's connected to everyone and living with everyone and in communion with everyone that he really thrives and really finds his best self. So there's a metaphor we can play with, and I'm sure there's some application for us in our real lives there, no doubt.
Yeah, I've also think about it, one of the big themes I think for Darrow especially is around brotherhood. And you see, I feel like the portrayal of brotherhood in like this book kind of makes me feel like how the first trilogies reminded me of, where they were at the institute, and there was like a very kind of clear purpose, and less of a focus on like the big picture, if you will, in terms of like the broader society. But here it's like it's so complicated and there's so much going on, and they go back to sort of that concept of like Darrow and Cassius, Darrow and Severo, time and time again about like what does it mean that they call each other brother, or that they're close. And I think even like Cassius's kind of like final words with Darrow is about their relationship and about what they mean to each other. I don't think there's a lot of portrayals in media that really get at like the power and like being open, that like two men saying like that we're brothers and we can count on each other, and like going back to that concept of like where would I be without you. I think it's really, I don't know, it's really hard to, it's easy to like miss that as like a really important theme, I think, because it's not I don't know, it's just like a complex relationship they have. It's not perfect, you know. It's
Hmm.
not those relationships have a lot of distrust and pain and sorrow, but also like there's a strength in those brotherhood relationships that are like pretty unique.
Hmm.
And I think those are some of the relationships that made me really want to lean in and be like, wow, like that's powerful, you know. And
Yeah.
there's not, it's just hard to portray that. I think in a lot of ways, you don't see a lot of great examples of elsewhere.
Yeah. Maybe because honestly, it takes a lot of time, I think, to develop a relationship like that. A lot of time and a lot of tragedy. The one media portrayal I'm thinking of, and I'm only a little bit familiar with it, was Band of Brothers, which I believe it's a series depicting a squad of soldiers in one of the world wars. Um, and often that's held up as an example of like, hey, here's this band of brothers, and it's the military bond, the war bond that can be there. um but I know too, I mean, oftentimes looking at, if you look at some of the church fathers, especially some of the monastic fathers, when they talk about their relationship with a fellow monk or with their spiritual father, uh engaged in a lot of like spiritual toil and a lot of ascetic labors, there's a bonding that can come through something like that also. But you're right. It's really, I don't know. I find it really beautiful, really encouraging to see that, like, hey, this kind of relationship that can be really close, really intimate, without being manipulative, without being sexual, is really possible. But it comes through that shared struggle. It comes through that shared vision. It comes through that knowing and being known. Like in our particular cast of characters here, I mean, they know each other on a super super deep level. They've seen each other like way beyond their worst, and everything, and still choose to be with each other. And so they kind of depict a love that isn't at all contingent on feelings, but much more, we're practicing a love toward each other because we need to, or for whatever reason. But it's very much this lived experience of love.
Mhm. I love that practicing this love towards it. You know, that's really huge. Mm.
Yeah. So now that I've said a profound thing, now I need to go like actually practice that with my people. So be like,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, it's true. Like, how do we show up? You know, like we talked about before, like just like stories like this, I think can, you know, you can like read a powerful story and be like, oh, that was a really cool story. But then I think you can also read a powerful story and be like, what, like, what does this tell me about how I want to live my life? You know, and I think for me, it's like, I think the fact that they wrestle with like change and being different and thinking about their pasts and you know trying to move forward in a different way, like those are some of the things I want to think about. I think I also really like that they like the fact that they're, you know, when they think about um the relationships they have and this idea, I think one of the big themes too is like the idea of like going home, and they wrestle with that, like, do we go, let's go home to Mars, you know, let's go home and do this. And at one point they're so close they can see it, but then they're told, you know, you can't come here now, you have to go and find us some help, basically. And it just makes me think about how do I want to show up in spaces where there's a lot riding on my decisions or a lot riding on my ability to show up, but also be who I want to be and not be driven and just like, it's not all about just being driven by fear. It's actually being driven by like the character and the person I want to become, and like trying to think about who that person is in those moments is really important to me, because I think that's where you see some of the greatest moments of this book is like when a character sacrifices, or when a character doesn't give in to darkness and fear and self absorption, but like tries to thrive in a way that's not the norm and not the how things usually are, you know. So I think there's a lot for me to like take away and just sit with more about like, who do I want to be, you know?
Yeah. So again, dear folks, this is why we read stories, is to learn about ourselves, and also why we should be careful about what stories we read, because I mean, we can take in some pretty foul characters as well. But I really love what you're saying, Mike, about really looking at yourself and looking at who you want to be. And I would agree too, very much. Like I want to be someone who can stick it out and make sacrifices and rise to the occasion and, be heroic. And it's, now my challenge is, okay, so how do I do that without becoming a war god? But in a gentle way. But it's a really true thing. Really, yeah, it's a powerful story in that way, in the way that stories are powerful. So, um, let's wrap this installment there with lots to think about. So if you're listening and if you're if you're listening and you haven't read the story, apologies. But hopefully if you are familiar with the story world and enjoying this, then that's great. We'll come back with more of the story next time, and explore more about the nature of humanity. In the meantime, Mike, if someone wanted to reach out to you for any reason, what's a good way to get a hold of you?
Oh, yeah. Just email is probably best. My email is mike.savara, SAVARA @gmail.com. Thanks for listening.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you for listening. Please drop us a note at patreon.com/MosesBarnaby. Drop us a couple dollars. You can like, rate, and review the show in all the places. And yes, go read some books. We'll be back to talk about more books with you soon. Thank you, and good night.